so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of incorporating behavior change techniques into the game design process, and I'm going to go through a little bit of a case study today. I'm a fast talker, and I only have 20 minutes, so I'm just going to preamble and say I'm putting my cards up here, so if you guys have any questions, you can follow up with me afterwards. So can games really change behavior? You know, that's a question that we hear a lot, and it's kind of one of the ubiquitous things that we're all trying to kind of get to with in terms of our impact in games. And so I'm going to use a case study that we worked on here at Games for Change to talk through kind of the model and the process for this a little bit. And also just to demonstrate that, yes, games can really change behavior. And this is one that we did a full evaluation on, and we were able to demonstrate that and show efficacy in a couple different places. So those of you not familiar with this, we actually created a series of games to act as companion pieces to the Nicholas Kristof book, Half the Sky, and a PBS documentary that accompanied it. And it was kind of a part of a huge transmedia movement and program that we kind of did a suite of games to touch on a number of different topics, but these were all related to empowering women across the world. And so we were able to demonstrate some different types of impact, and we put a nice report together after our first month out to show kind of some of the different types of things. We were able to raise donations and then put those towards NGOs that were working on different capacities in the space. We were able to get over 1 million players, and we also were able to get a couple other interesting touch points. But when we talk about impact, you know, these are all kind of a little bit easier to achieve than the thing that we call behavior change. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and we're going to focus on one particular game that we did, as I said, kind of have an evaluation conducted, and I'll talk you through the process from kind of start to finish. And yeah, like I said, if you have questions, you can follow up with me. So this particular suite of games was funded by USAID, and so we worked with them to actually build and develop the games, and then also conduct testing in the field with the intended audience. And so the game I'm going to talk about today is really specifically about pregnancy health and pregnancy health awareness. And so when we were tasked with this idea of, hey, how do you get people to kind of have healthier behaviors in their pregnancies, this was kind of a tall order. And so I'm going to break down the process that we did to get this game made and evaluated. So this game itself was determined through research that the measurable positive shifts in knowledge and attitudes and behavioral intentions shifted after gameplay. And I'll talk you through kind of what we did for that evaluation and how it was conducted as well. So first, to talk a little bit about the design process. This, if you guys aren't familiar with this, is actually a Games for Change methodology, and it's available on the G4C website, and it actually breaks down into steps, and you can follow it, and it's a really good kind of framework if you're not familiar with a design methodology that's user-centered. But the idea is that you kind of start with your audience, and you really try to design your experience around them and their needs. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that methodology, but what we're going to really kind of unpack today is what really has to happen in a game and how do you design it for behavior change to occur. So we're mostly going to be focusing on this kind of impact stage, right? What happens when you're actually successfully getting behavior change at that impact level? And so some of you guys might be familiar with this pyramid. We've shared this at other events before, and it's this idea that, you know, there's tiers of difficulty in terms of achieving these types of impact, right? The hardest ones to achieve are successfully changing behaviors of your players in the intended way that you wanted to, right? You might change their behaviors other ways, but that may not be what you're trying to do, right? So the thing that we're going to talk about today is really that top of the pyramid. How do we get there? And so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about something that is called the Combi Model. And the idea here is we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's an entire field of practice devoted to behavior change that exists outside of the game world. And we are encouraging you to incorporate these processes, but also work with subject matter experts in this space, right? You don't have to be the behavior change expert yourself if you're also the game designer, right? Collaborate, work with people. But this is a model that is used in the behavior change space. And it basically is kind of a framework for breaking down how to kind of successfully achieve behavior change. So if we look at kind of these core behaviors, there's things that influence that, and it's capabilities, opportunities, and motivations. We can look at and kind of break down opportunities in different ways. You have knowledge, cognitive, interpersonal skills, memory, and attention. And don't worry if you're not capturing all these slides, I'll send them to the team and they'll post them online and you guys can capture them later because I don't have time to go through all of the details and there's a lot packed in here. But just knowing that there are kind of ways to tease out capabilities. Likewise, there's ways to tease out opportunities. Likewise, there's ways to tease out motivations. And motivation, you guys will start to notice that there's a lot of things on the screen that align with the things that we think about when we're designing experiences in games. Goals, intentions, rewards, right? And so there's automatic motivation, there's intrinsic motivation. So when we're talking about the Combi model, we're talking about infusing all of that into the design itself. So let's do kind of a quick Combi model for taking pills, which is relative to the game about pregnancy health. One of the things we were trying to change in those behaviors was getting people to use family planning, to use birth control pills to space out their pregnancies. So let's pretend we're starting the design of our game. We want to reduce the number of pregnancies. We want people taking more pills. That's the behavior we're trying to change. So if you look down here, we've kind of got our ultimate taking pills. And then you can kind of start breaking down the capabilities, right? Maybe they don't have access, maybe they don't have knowledge, and maybe they don't have opportunities or they don't have healthcare, right? And so we're talking about audiences in the developing world, not audiences here. So these are women that may not have access to institutionalized healthcare in the same way that we are, if you want to call our healthcare that, whatever it is. So, when we talk about it, you can list out all these different things and kind of brainstorm all the things that might be preventative towards getting people to take pills. But in fact, guess what? There's research on it, right? So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're not trying to kind of do research that's already been conducted. You can go and look in existing research and then pull out the things that maybe are going to be the most preventative towards people taking pills. And so we're trying to identify the barriers, the things that are going to maybe prevent people from moving forward with the step or would maybe confuse them and things like that. So how do we get this into the design, right? We've got all this research, there's stuff out there, there's textbooks, there's volumes of things. How do you decide what to use and where to kind of focus? So again, jumping back into kind of this kind of method of thinking, I'm gonna walk you through what we did for this 9 minutes game and kind of talk you through the steps. So first we decided we wanna make a game for pregnant women. So we kind of had an idea that the audience would probably be ladies, but we also decided we wanted to influence their husbands as well and have influence and change their behaviors too. So the idea was, how can we most effectively get to this idea of kind of healthier pregnancies? And so we decided we wanted to kind of focus on women and their husbands. We wanted to focus on women with lower literacy rates, so audiences that may not have had education or may have no literacy at all, and also targeting areas where birth control and family planning was actually a cultural stigma, right? People aren't talking about this, it's uncomfortable. And so this was our audience, and it's a really hard to reach audience. And if you think about creating content for an audience that can't read, there's a lot of constraints that came into the design, including making everything visual-based, using as little text as possible, and making it kind of really simple and fast gameplay. So when we started looking at our audiences, we had this funding from USAID. We wanted to have a global impact, but what we really also needed to do was not boil the ocean. And so we had to target some audiences specifically for both designing our game and conducting our evaluations. So we chose audiences in Kenya and in India, and so that we would have kind of a variety of different types of audiences to test with. We created specific game graphics with audiences, so we actually went to these places and we worked with them and had them give feedback on art and cultural hairstyles, all sorts of things, so that we could infuse their kind of culture into the game itself. We also worked with developers who were stationed on the ground and based in these countries as well, designers and developers. So then when it comes to context, right, we're thinking about not just kind of who's using this game, but how might they be using it? And again, this notion that there are illiterate populations out there that we're trying to reach, they're not necessarily going to be on Facebook. They're not necessarily going to be able to access a website. And so we really had to be considerate about the technology that we were introducing and expecting people to use around these games. And so the end result are a series of what we call dumb phone games. They're not smartphones, right? They're the ones that you push the buttons on that we used to use back 10, 15 years ago. Some people still have them. So we're starting to kind of break down our model, right? So we've got our audience set. We've got a specific context. It's a little bit challenging. But now when it comes to impact, this is where, again, we said, okay, well, what does make healthier pregnancies? I'm not an expert in pregnancies, so I needed to go and talk to people who had that expertise. And we brought in subject matter experts across a number of different areas. They told us what the research says, and we started figuring out ways to incorporate that. So if you look at kind of this list of things, and there was many more that we wanted to incorporate, we had to decide kind of which things we were going to evaluate against. Our evaluation team basically said, we can't track every indicator in the world. You have to pick the ones that you think are going to make the most sense, the things that are going to have the most impact, where we think we're going to be most effective. And so we had to do that. So we had this long list. Throw it back into the pyramid format. You can kind of see which things we had a sense would be maybe harder and easier to achieve. And so, things like building knowledge and awareness around good pregnancy habits, that's relatively easy to achieve. We knew that we could probably introduce some things in a single round of gameplay and people could kind of achieve that awareness, right? That's an easy checkbox. But to get up to that behavior change where they're taking pills, they're going to the hospital, they're seeking out support, they're resting, they're doing these things that actually are different from their current behaviors, that's a little bit more difficult. And so, again, focusing just for the sake of this conversation today on a single one of these, we looked at, okay, look at pills. How are we going to influence people in this space? And so, again, we went back to our Combi model. We looked at what the different barriers are. Again, not trying to focus and have every single one of these in our game, but working with the research team to understand what was the most complex barrier, right? What was the thing that happened the most frequently? What was the thing that you see across all cultures and not just in one or the other? And so those were the areas that we decided to focus. And again, taking the pills was a very important one in this sense. So when do we start to incorporate these into the design itself? I'm going to kind of show you a simple production line. This is, we're talking about science, right? You're basically building a hypothesis. My game will change people's behavior by doing X. After you build that hypothesis, you're going to need to actually create something, and then you're going to need to test it. And a lot of people forget about testing, and this is really important because back when I was consulting with a lot of the groups that would come to Games for Change for help, usually the situation would be, we built this game, we're really confident that it's going to change people's lives, we spent all our funding, now what do we do? And the problem is, if you can't demonstrate through a study, through real research, that your game is effective at doing what's intended, it's not going to be very helpful to you, and it's not going to be helpful to your intended audiences, because they're just not going to see it, right? So if you think about this idea of before the design process starts, so if under the second layer here you see the actual designing of the game, you're going to want to do about 4 steps of pre-production that was really going through the research, understanding the research, and determining what your theory of change is actually going to be. So getting to that place before you start thinking about design. You might have the greatest idea for Minecraft with science, but if it's not really the right model and it's not the right mode, you don't want to come up with the whole design first and then have to go back and try to retrofit the stuff. It doesn't really work that way. So again, not expecting everybody here to become instantaneous subject matter experts overnight. It's not really your goal, probably, but there are people out there who are going to be experts in this space. There are people who've studied this for decades. So don't try to reinvent the wheel there. Just bring them in as your partners. What else did I have here? So indicators of behavior change. So again, thinking about how you're going to evaluate efficacy once you've got your game built, you want to kind of start thinking about assessment. And even though this is kind of the last step in our pretty color wheel, it's actually something you want to be thinking about in tandem with that impact, right? How are you going to actually measure this thing to demonstrate that it's effective? And usually you want to come up with some indicators of success, so ways to actually tell something happened the way you wanted. And then you have to think about how you're going to measure that. Because we're dealing with technology, because we have a lot of data points in the game systems themselves, if you think about what you need to measure before you start designing your game, you might be able to capture all the measurement you need in the data in the game, right? You might not need to conduct a second study outside of gameplay, but it depends on how you build it, depends what you're trying to measure for. Let's see, so what else do we have? So again, jumping back into kind of our impact, our color wheel, you want to then kind of make some decisions around the technology, what type of tools you're going to need to use. That's going to have somewhat of an impact on how much you're going to need to spend on development and design of your game. If you're designing a simple 2-dimensional platformer game, it's a very separate cost than if you're a 3D, immersive space that you can explore for hours and hours, right? And so knowing what the platform is, knowing what your technology is going to be, is going to severely impact your budgeting and your fundraising in some cases that will have to follow this. In this case, we decided to use mobile phones. These were phones that are fairly accessible in the developing world. You can buy them really inexpensively. They can get very, very sophisticated, even at a low cost. And so that's what we decided to use. These phones don't support much. You can't really put much of a game on them. So each of these games also had to be under 200 kilobytes, which is about the size of an email, right? So these were super simplified, but still graphical and had animations and all the other things. No audio though. When it came up for financials, I think we ended up spending about $150K for both the development and the testing of this whole entire suite of games, the 3 mobile games. Part of that is that we used developers from the countries that we were developing the games for, so the cost to produce them was lower. We also, as a nonprofit, were able to hustle and get some additional grants and things like that to help supplement it. But the majority of the money came from a large source. That was great. I would say that in my experience with all the other projects I worked on at Games for Change, that's incredibly rare. And usually the financials model is more of a fundraising in different circles, combining those into a bucket of money and then using that to move forward. But the one thing I would say, just even though this talk isn't about financials specifically, when you're doing your budgeting, budget in for evaluation, or assume you're going to need to find a partner who's going to do evaluation for you, because there's a cost that's added to that, and it can be expensive, and we'll get into a little bit of the details of it. When it comes to gameplay, again, we wanted to have something that was highly graphical, that had fast gameplay and would be repetitive so people could play it again and again. One of the things we wanted people to have was memory retention. So the idea that we didn't want them playing the game once and walking away, we wanted them playing once or twice a day for repeated periods of time. We had 3 different levels of gameplay. It was kind of a match 3 icon matching, beat matching style mechanic. And that way we could introduce a lot of content through visuals, but also keep kind of a very simplified kind of rapid fire gameplay style. And the content basically was covering the do's and don'ts of pregnancy, but with lots of kind of tips hidden in between. In terms of execution, we worked with partners. I usually have a partner slide that shows all their logos. I couldn't find it today, but essentially we had partners for everything, right? We had partners for distribution, we had partners for development, we had partners for promotion, we had partners for evaluation. Each of these partners played a very distinct role, and in some cases we specifically pursued them because they could do that role without us having to pay them very much. When you're in a nonprofit space, you're trying to peel every dollar you can. And so we were able to do that with some of our partnerships, but the main idea here is, don't try to go at this alone. You work with people that are interested in the same stuff as you, that are working towards the same goals. And now, in terms of assessment, I'm going to kind of drill into here a little bit more since we talked about impact earlier. Talking about the BCTs, the behavioral change techniques that are kind of most critical to measure, determining how you're going to actually measure that, either within the game itself through data collection or going out into the field, watching people play your games, doing interviews, conducting sessions, all that type of stuff. Depending, again, on what you're trying to measure, it may be really complex, it might not be as complex. I'm losing time here, so I just want to get into kind of a little bit of detail on how we tested these games in the field. So, how did we go about this testing? We had a lot of team people that worked with us, and again, this was all people that we stationed in Kenya and in India, and so we sent them out. We had a network of people that were supporting with us. What did the study look like? We had to train all of our moderators and interviewers. We had to get investigators and moderators into kind of gender-matched conversations so that people weren't uncomfortable. Again, because the subject matter was a little bit sensitive, we didn't want to have people kind of giving us answers that maybe made them uncomfortable in the first place. We had to train our data collection teams on how to go out into the field and even play the games, had to explain to them kind of every detail of how we wanted them to conduct these interviews. The study was a mixed method study. We had 608 women, 308 men. It's a pretty large study. We were also conducting in various locations, so we were moving around. The study participants ranged in age, and we had a third of those participants that were female were pregnant, because obviously the intended target audience. One thing that was really interesting when we heard back from our field workers who were doing the studies, they noticed that all of the women felt uncomfortable holding the devices. They felt like they were kind of going to break it, or it was kind of too, they were uncertain with kind of what to do with the technology. So you'll notice that they're actually playing the games on the floor here, which was not expected, but also a good learning moment for us. And so we had them play the game up to 6 times, and then we conducted pre and post tests. And what you'll see on this, it's hard to read this graph a little bit in the light here, but you'll see that in a number of these categories, we did see significant shifts pre and post test. around visiting the antenatal clinic, saving money, drinking water, resting. Several of the behavior change things that we were seeking, we were actually able to validate in our post-tests. So jumping back to this kind of fun color wheel, right? We've got a process to kind of think through the design process. We've got a process of thinking through the behavior change models. But what if you're not an expert, right? This is my favorite graphic. I use it as often as possible. We don't all have to be experts in everything. I just bought a house. This is probably what's going to look like after a few years. But there are places that do that, and I'm going to just give my own company a little pump right now because we have a staff of behavior change experts on staff. We're a design firm that focuses in behavior change design. We leverage strategic design to work with a number of different industries, but if you are looking for support on behavior change with your game project, come talk to me, talk to other behavior change experts, seek out people who are working in this space, doing research on what you're interested in, and start partnering with them. Bring them into the development, bring them into design as early as possible. We do that all day long at my design firm, and if you're interested, it's a lot of fun. So what will you guys need to do to get behavior change in your games? Thank you.